Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. This is a show for the Christian woman who is driven and inspiring, sensitive yet strong. And maybe, like me, you've felt like you're a little too much at times. I want you to remember that you, my friend, are a chosen daughter of the King, and you have been fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and I'm joined by my co-host, Holly Kane, and sometimes by other guests as well. Join us as we discuss leadership as a Christian woman in our churches, business or workplace, communities, and our homes. We're so glad you're here. Now on to the episode. What happens when you end up in a leadership role after devastating circumstances? How do you navigate the tension between building a business and being faithful to God's calling? In this episode, I interview Abby Rike Rockenbaugh, and we discuss how she learned to embrace unexpected leadership after devastating circumstances. You will hear her story of the defining moment that changed her life forever, and how she navigated the grief that followed. You'll also hear some powerful reminders about the importance of sharing your own story and how digging into God's Word and truly understanding Him and how much He loves us can change you and your leadership. I can't wait for you to hear this interview with Abby. I know it's going to impact you and bless you. But first, I want to introduce Abby so you know a little bit more about her. Abby Rike Rockenbaugh is a professional speaker, a published author, and former teacher who now helps bloggers hone their public speaking skills. She believes everyone has a story to tell, and she aims to help bloggers craft theirs in such a way that they authentically connect with their audience. She's had the opportunity to share her story on Ellen, The Today Show, and as a contestant on The Biggest Loser. When she's not traveling for a speaking event, feeding her fainting goats, or eating Mexican food with her husband, you can find her over at speakingforbloggers.com. If you want the show notes for this episode, head over to estherlittlefield.com/Abby. That's spelled A-B-B-Y. Now let's dive into the episode. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. We're so glad to have you here with us. And I am here today with Abby Rike Rockenbaugh, and I'm super excited to be talking with her. Abby and I have known each other for quite a while online, but this is our first chance to talk in person. And I'm excited to have you here, Abby. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am thrilled to be here, and it's so neat how real relationships can form in this online space.
Yes.
So a little about me, I run an online ministry at rockthis.org, hence a little play off the Rockenbaugh. And then just recently, as in baby new, I have just launched a new business because I didn't have enough to do.
Right.
It's called speakingforbloggers.com.
Okay.
And basically, I just saw where so much of the online space is moving more towards video, and it's also moving more towards podcasts and places where bloggers who went in to write, not to speak, are finding themselves thrust with either a camera or a microphone. And so because I taught speech and theater for 14 years and I've been speaking professionally for the past 9 years, I just thought, wow, what a neat opportunity to serve and help women share their stories well.
Awesome. I love that. And what about where do you live and anything about, your hobbies or anything fun that you do?
If you can't tell by the accent, I am from Texas, but we have been in Nashville for the past 5 years. We affectionately call it Rockenbaugh Mountain because we live in this little, I call it the most lovely hamlet that no one knows about. And growing up, I was always lots of makeup, big hair, high heels, all that jazz. And now I find myself I have fainting goats.
Awesome.
I have chickens, and now I'm a farmer.
Wow.
totally, but kind of. I'm a pretend farmer, and I love it.
Yes. That's great. That's great. Awesome. Okay. So I would love to hear a little bit about, your leadership journey and how you've gotten into a leadership role in your life.
Well, I think the best way to describe me would be the reluctant leader.
Okay. There's a lot of us out there.
When you're growing up and you have leadership skills, then you're just bossy and you're
Mm,
annoying. And so I think that you learn in order to assimilate and have friends that you tone down those leadership
mm,
qualities because, you want to have friends.
right.
But
Yeah.
then as you get older and God calls you into these different places, then it's kind of unlearning those things that you learned so
Mm,
that you can be effective in the calling in which you've been given.
right. Yeah. It's so interesting. I think that you pointed out that when you have the leadership skills when you're young, especially as a female, I think you're perceived as bossy, right? I mean, I remember getting that a
Yes.
lot when I was a kid. You're so bossy, but that leads to potential leadership down the road for sure.
Right. And especially when your heart isn't bossy.
Right.
And I think that was always the disconnect for me. It wasn't so much that my heart was bossy, but when you're trying to organize and do different
Mhm.
things, that's just, in an 8-year-old, then you're just bossy.
Right, right. No, I think that makes such a good point that you weren't trying to do anything, negative to the people around you. It just came natural for you to organize and gather people together and do those things, right?
Right.
So speaking of, your childhood, when do you think that you realized that you actually were a leader?
I mean, I was always the one in groups in school where either I would be chosen as the leader, or if there wasn't a leader assigned, you'd sit there for a minute and then nothing would get done. So finally, you just step up and make
Yeah.
certain that you're going to get things done. Honestly, I think it was really in college. So I was a speech communications major. In one of our classes was it was group communication, and in that we had designated roles, and so there was another girl who had stepped up as leader, and I was like glad
Mhm.
because sometimes it's just exhausting at times to always be the leader.
Yes, it is.
And it was so interesting that when the course was over, we had to do these assessments and whatever. And my professor sat me down, and I remember sitting in her office and her saying, Abby, every person in that group put that when they were asked who was really the leader, who did you wish had been the leader, that every person had put me.
Wow.
And I think she saw my hesitation in that. And
Mhm.
it was such an encouragement when she said, Abby, you are a leader and you're an effective leader. And
Mm.
so that was a kind of a turning point for me that, oh, it's okay to be the leader. You're not
Right.
just the bossy, annoying, goofy kid that,
Yeah.
that good things happen when you step up and lead.
Yeah. And I love that she called that out in you. That's something that I've taught to other people about, that we can specifically remember a point when someone called out our gifts and our leadership skills. And that truly makes a difference when you can do that for someone else or
It,
someone does
it
that for
was
you.
it was a neat experience.
Yeah. Okay. So what about any other life events in your life thus far that you think have contributed to, you becoming a leader?
I think that everybody has that defining moment in
Mm,
their life. The moment is the demarcation line of the before and the after.
right.
So I grew up in a small town in Texas. I went to college and I became a speech teacher. And I was so happy in that role. I was happily married and had a gorgeous, curly headed, redheaded little Spitfire.
Yeah.
and a brand new baby,
Mm.
2.5 weeks old.
Mm-hmm.
And the defining moment was on October the 13th, 2006, when a car going 100 miles an hour hit them head on.
Mm.
And it was that day that was the defining moment in my life.
Right.
Um, the before
Mm-hmm.
and then the after. And so when we talk about what shapes us, for so long, leadership was absolutely not even on the was not even a blip on the radar.
Mm-hmm.
It was just walking out that grief path, and so through that ugly, hard, horrible journey
Right.
was when I think I always thought I had faith. Let me back up. So I always thought I had faith, but it had never been tested. And
Mm.
so at that point, it was a season of, is God everything that I thought him to be? And so 12 years later, I can say that the blessing is that I know he is that big.
Right.
And so through that, then it became about, I felt instead of it just being like, those are the giftings that God had given me, it was then that he opened up this door and called me to it.
Mm.
And so it was following that it was for me to share my testimony, for me to point people to Jesus, to say, if it's possible for me to get out of bed every day, then it is possible for you. Because in
Right.
my own strength, I couldn't. I mean, nobody can get up from that in their own strength.
That's such an incredible story, and honestly, that's the first memory that I have of us interacting is reading your blog post about the grief journey that you went through and just how powerful that was, and myself having my own grief journey. I that just hit me so hard, and I appreciate you sharing your story because I think everybody does have a story, and if we don't share it, we don't have the opportunity to bless someone else with how God has worked in our own lives. So I just
And
want to thank you for
well,
sharing.
thank you. And I think that's what is so important to me, especially like with this new endeavor. As crazy as it is, a lot of people are so remiss on sharing their story.
Hmm.
Or if they do share their story, they don't know which parts to
Hmm.
share or how to share it effectively. And that's what I'm learning is that what a unique and special gift God has given me, because people's stories are important and
Right.
they're sacred and they're tender.
Yeah.
And but they need to be told,
Hmm.
because again, it's not about us. And I'm sure you've heard it before, but it's your story for his glory. And that's what I have to remind myself every time, because it's not that the pain, it's
Hmm.
not that I don't miss my family every single day. I do, but I rest in the promises of what God says is true. And there are people out there that don't know that truth and they don't know that hope. And so if I tear up sometimes when I tell it, or if I get through it, or if I just lose it completely, it doesn't matter so
Hmm.
long as someone else is
Yeah.
benefited from hearing it.
Yes. Yeah. Having a message to share with the world, I think is often part of leadership. That a lot of leaders, as they're growing up or as they're an adult, they realize that they have a message to share. Would you say that that was the moment that you experienced that deep loss and that grief? Is that the moment that you realized that you had a message to share, or is it a different point in your journey where you may have recognized that?
I think, I mean, like I said, for the first couple of years, it was getting up and surviving.
Yeah.
And it was this lie that people say that, just get through the first year. And I was thinking,
Mm.
where is my gold star and certificate? Because I'm an achiever and I've survived and I
Yeah.
want my certificate.
And why isn't it now I can move on to something else, right?
Absolutely.
Because
That
that's
why am I not better?
mhm,
And So then I think that leadership truly comes from being obedient to the next right step.
Mm.
And so, as crazy as it seems, because I think sometimes like we put God in this box of what he looks like and what he uses.
Right.
And as nutty as it sounds, he opened the door for me to go on The Biggest Loser reality TV show.
That was probably unexpected, right?
Oh, my Lantas. So it's a funny story. I pretty much, at first, it's really exciting because you think, I
Mm,
mean, I'm in a town of 5,000 people. People that were on TV were a big deal. I mean,
right.
I've later learned that that's ridiculous. So let me clarify that. But at the time, it was really exciting. And, you do like flying to LA sounds so
Mm,
cool until you
right.
realize you're in a hotel room for 23 hours a day because they don't want you interacting because they want it interacting on camera. But as I went through the interview process, there was this period where I was like, oh, my Lantis, I think they're going to pick me. And then
Mm,
panic set in. And I
mm.
literally did everything that I could to make them not pick me. I will say that without a shadow of a doubt, that was the path that
Mm,
God had for me without a
right.
shadow of a doubt. And
Mm,
so you want to talk about petrified, out of your comfort zone on every level. Because quite frankly, at that point, it was so early in the grief in
mm,
that second year, it was about
mhm.
2.5 years. It
Okay.
was so raw and tender that I was in a different place than I am now.
Right.
But I so desperately wanted to be better. And
Mhm,
so that was the avenue, as nutty as it
mm.
is.
Right.
But it was through that experience that then God just opened up the door. And so I've been speaking for the past 9 years. I've never advertised. I've never marketed myself. I've never said, hey, do you want me to come speak?
Mhm.
God has done this miraculous thing where he thrust me on this stage. And to be honest, I was much more comfortable in that safety zone behind
Mhm.
the scenes, having my students excel and be the stars.
Mm,
Being on stage was not what I thought, oh, let me do this.
right.
Oh gosh. But that's where I think that leadership is so much about obedience and
Mhm.
stepping out of your comfort zone and doing the next thing that God calls you to do.
Absolutely. That is one of the first things that I realized when I was preparing for this podcast actually was I had this desire to do this podcast, but I was like, well, what on earth? That seems crazy. Like something that you just think is kind of impossible, right? And then I read the
Mhm.
story of Abraham and I read through his story about how basically God gave him this big vision, but he only told him one step of the journey at a time. He never told him all the things that were going to happen because if he did, he Abraham probably would have been like, "See ya," right? But
Absolutely. We can't handle that much at one time.
right. But just taking the next right step. And I think that's such a good point about leadership that a lot of times we can't see where God is going to take us. And we just have to trust that He is going to bring us where He wants us and where we can be the best and most impactful leader.
And I think so many times the next right step, because let me back up. So let's say that we think, oh, we know we're called to leadership and we have this huge vision, but
Hmm.
the next right step is tiny.
Hmm.
And then the
Yes.
next right step is tiny. And in our hearts, we're thinking, oh, we want to serve God big or we want to lead big. And I truly believe that the size of your ministry, the size of what you're doing means nothing. You are to be effective where you are. You
Mhm.
do for one what you want to do for all. And I think that's where I think that leadership becomes getting a really clear vision of what that looks like. And it may not be a huge platform, it may be a small platform, but we need to serve with the same vigor because then it
Mhm.
keeps our hearts pure of what we're really doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could not agree more with that because we look at the big, what we quote unquote big leaders or big names, right? And we see what they're doing and we're like, "Oh, wow, what if we could do that?" But
Sure.
they started small too. Like every single person doesn't wake up with a platform of 20,000 people waiting to hear from them, right? I mean, and that may or may not be what God has for any one of us. So,
Right. But I think that it's very easy to get caught up in that,
mhm,
especially in the social media world where everything is, it's almost as though your worth is how many email subscribers you have or how many followers. And it's, I mean, I've had a little and I've had a lot. And I'm going to
mhm,
tell you, it's not like it's that fabulous thing on the other side.
right.
I think whenever I am most keeping my eyes straight on Jesus and
Mhm.
off all of the others things, and it is a daily, that's a
Right.
daily choice. That is some daily bread.
Yes.
I think there that then you can withstand the enemy attacks and everything stays in perspective of what
Mhm.
truly matters and what God truly judges and asks of us.
Yes, yes, I love that. Yeah, so what would you say are some of the things that you do to help yourself stay focused on what God has called you to versus what other people might say are the best things to do as a business owner, as a ministry leader? Where do you find balance in that tension?
I think that the biggest thing that I can say that I have done right, and there are lots of things where I've stumbled in
Mhm.
growing a business, obviously. But the one thing that I can say is that if it does not rest well in your soul, don't do it. I don't
Mm,
care if people guarantee that it works. I don't care if that's the best practices for online business. If it does not sit well in your soul, then you answer to an audience of one.
mhm.
And let me say this, I've had people tell me that, some of the things I've done were foolish. I've had them tell me that I have money mindset issues,
Mm, mhm.
um, which is laughable.
Yeah.
This is what I think. I think that money can't be our end goal. It just
Mhm.
can't be. When you're in Christian leadership, if you're in business, personally, I think everything is our ministry. So when we're in
Right,
business,
right.
whether it's faith based or not, but this nonsense about not doing something that is considered what you're supposed to do.
Mhm.
But again, there are things that God will expect or ask of you that are going to be different, because
Yes.
then when he blesses that business either with growth, impact, influence, money, whatever, he gets all the glory, and some guru over here that
Mhm.
whatever
Yeah,
doesn't get the glory. And I think
right.
that's the biggest thing with leadership is you have to be willing to swim against the current at times.
Mm. Absolutely. Okay, so Abby, one of the things that we love talking about on this podcast is how God has wired us all differently and how he has given us, unique gifts and skills to be used, like you said, for his glory and in our leadership. So, are there any tools that you use or that you have used in the past that have helped you to understand yourself better? And what would you say you've learned from doing that?
Hands down, the best tool I ever did was taking that spiritual gifts test.
Okay.
I took it and then I had two people closest to me take it,
Mm,
because sometimes I think we don't have the clearest vision when it comes to ourselves.
right.
And I think through the study of the spiritual gifting, then sometimes I think, and I don't know if it goes back to that childhood being bossy um or whatever, it's that we need to claim our spiritual gifting,
Mm,
because there's no, obviously we can develop pride with that, but when we acknowledge it, that is not pride. That would be the same as saying I have brown eyes. God gave me brown eyes.
right.
Nobody thinks I'm being prideful if I say I have brown eyes,
Mhm.
but it can be perceived as being prideful if I say my spiritual gifting is in teaching
Mm,
and in leading,
mhm.
even though I have no more control of that than I do the color of my eyes.
Right, right.
So I think that was the first thing for me because, again, I think I was the reluctant
Mhm.
leader. And so stepping into that and just owning that, I think was the best thing I could do as far as being more effective.
Right. And I think that goes right in line with the idea of embracing our identity, right? Because like you said, your gifts that God has given you are just what he's given you. It's part of who you are, it's part of your identity. So would you have any words of wisdom for any women that maybe are struggling with embracing, who they are or how God has wired them and how you've done that in your own life?
So I'm okay. So we're just chatting for reals here. Honestly, I think what I realized is that whenever I say, "Oh, I'm not a leader," "Oh, I'm not good enough to do that," then I'm basically calling God a liar,
Mm,
calling His promises lies. And so there came a point where I don't care what the world said. I don't care what mean kids said. I don't care even the things that I say to myself.
mhm,
If they're not truthful, then I have to go to the only place in this world that we can find absolute truth, and that is the Word of God.
mhm.
And I'm not talking about finding verses that um, I think verses are taken out of context. So let me be very clear
Yes.
here. But when I find the true meaning of who God says I am, it's not about thinking more of myself or
Mm,
less of myself. It's about death to self.
mm,
And so to me, death to self gives you a confidence because my confidence is in God who created me.
mm.
I hope that makes sense
It does,
because
it does, and it's like you said, it's actually believing the truth. It's choosing to believe the truth instead of having this false humility about, "Oh, well, that no, 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 I'm not that great." Like, because that's what I think we tend to, especially, and I don't know if you see this, but I feel like for women, a lot of times we have a hard time accepting our strengths and the ways that God has wired us, the gifts that He's given us. We have a hard time actually verbalizing them
Mhm.
because we feel like we're supposed to be like, well, I'm not that great, and have this kind of meek and humble attitude, which, like I said, I don't think that saying that is actually being humble. I think it's not believing the truth about who God says you are.
Absolutely. And notice that it's not about having this self confidence.
Hmm.
It's about having confidence in God.
Yes.
I call it God confidence. And
Hmm.
it's about, I always say, wrap it up in truth. And if and everybody struggles with the lies of the enemy
Hmm.
that you're overwhelmed, you feel way out of your league.
Hmm.
What are you doing? It's scary, all of those
Right.
things. But I think that's whenever it's go back to the word of God, go back to what is absolute truth.
Mm,
And the truth is whenever he has equipped or called you, then there is an equipping when we're obedient to what he tells us to do.
right.
Now, let me say this. I think that it's once you're in that gifting, it is a fine line of remaining where it's not, oh, look what I've done. I
Hmm.
mean, I think that that's one of those things too,
Mm,
is there is that tension, but it always goes back to obedience, not
yes.
just knowing what God says, but then
Right.
that's a struggle that
Yeah.
that obedience all the time.
That's awesome. So, do you have any mentors or people in your life that help you to kind of keep yourself in check, like you said, like when you have that balance of between embracing who God has said you are and, hey, look what I did. I did this thing. I wrote this book. I started this ministry. You know, are there people in your life that help you with that?
Yes, and I think that you have to be super intentional with that
Mm,
because I will say one of the biggest struggles for me you hear that phrase, it's lonely at the top
Mm,
or whatever. And regardless of the size of the place that you're at the top of or whatever, when you're leading, it is lonely.
mm-hmm.
And so it is imperative to find people. And I get it, like, sometimes people will let you down, they'll hurt your
Mm,
feelings, they'll lash out because they either want your gift or there's some issues going on
mm,
with them, and it can be very wounding. And
yes.
so I've had to be super intentional with finding I think that other true leaders that are in their calling are
Mm,
some of the most supportive, encouraging, that they want you to do well,
mm,
and that you create this climate of we all rise together.
mm-hmm,
And I think that you have to be very careful who you let in that circle.
mm-hmm,
And so I have a very dear friend that is very entrepreneurially minded because we think differently. We
mm-hmm.
are different.
Yeah.
So it's important to
Yes.
find people that get you,
Mm-hmm,
but that will tell you the truth. You do not want to surround yourself with people that are like, oh, you're great. Yes,
mm-hmm.
fabulous. You need people that will also give you those things to help you improve.
Right.
And then, of course, my mother is, she is fantastic because I can be so authentically me. The parts that you don't show the whole world when you're crying and having a nervous breakdown, you call your
Right.
mom. And you need those people too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, but that's the key, is that you need those people that are constructive and say things in love and have your best interest at heart.
Right. Yeah. It's such wise advice because I think that the idea that it's lonely at the top, I think there is some truth to that, that when you are a leader, when you're an entrepreneur, whatever the case might be, um, church leadership, that it can be very lonely because you do feel like you can't necessarily open up to everyone around you, which you probably shouldn't. But
Right.
to have those people that you can bounce ideas off, that you can be challenged by, that will call you out if you are being ridiculous, that is it's so important for sure. So, Abby, I know that you have a lot of different things that you are doing, and that you are probably like a lot of us that are multi passionate. So, you want to share a little bit about your passions and whatever ones you want to share, kind of what you're doing with those different passions or businesses, and how you're kind of keeping that all in balance, so to speak.
Well, that is a great question. Yes, I'm definitely multi passionate. I have a super passion for equipping women to be in the Word. Um, that was whenever I was going through the grief journey, and I was a prodigal for many, many years.
Mm,
But the Lord was so good and kind to me to woo me back home.
mm,
And the way He wooed me was through His Word. Because the world is so noisy. And I think right now it seems to be especially loud.
mm,
And I think that even though I'd grown up in the church and that I had placed my faith in Him at 6 years old, and I know for a doubt I was saved that
mm,
night without question, I wasn't discipled. Yes, I
mm,
was in church, but I feel like there is this missing component of true
mm,
discipleship. And so then I just experienced the Lord. It wasn't this smiting God
mm,
who was taking His rod to me, which I deserved.
mm,
I mean, that was what I
mm,
deserved. And instead, He wooed me back with the most loving, gracious hand. But it was through His Word that I got to know the true character of
mm,
God and not the world's perception of God. And so my passion, I mean, I don't know that I should say my passion is helping people read the Word.
mm.
The true passion is I want people to know the character of God.
Right.
I want people to know that He is trustworthy,
Mm,
that He is holy, that yes, there is perfect justice, but there is also this tender Father who you can run to and curl up in His lap,
mm.
the whole totality of who God is. And
Yes.
so for me, the most life altering, called me home to where I came home and have stayed home and have grown for the past almost 7 years of really that big change of
Right.
coming home. I want women to experience that.
Right.
Where it's not just, yes, I know who God is. Yes, I go to church on Sunday. I say a quick prayer when I need him. But where he transforms your heart
Mhm.
and changes who you are. So
Mm.
that is where rockthis.org comes into play, is that I want to help take those baby steps of fundamental Bible reading skills that I just feel like are not being really taught.
Mhm.
And the Bible can be so overwhelming, and something as simple as changing from an NIV or a King James version to the New Living Translation or the CSB, that there are things that we can do to make it where the word is absolutely alive
Right.
and
Yeah.
life changing. So that's like my number one passion.
Yes, love it and absolutely agree.
Without a doubt. And then, so about a year ago, I was going to launch Speaking for Bloggers,
Mm.
and the Lord said no. And I
Gotta
was
love
like,
that.
Lord, I mean, and I was deep into it, had spent money on a coach. I had interviewed very big names in the online space. We had already sat down. They'd given me an hour of their time. And the Lord said, no. Ooh. And I mean, as most leaders, we like to finish what we start,
Yes.
right? And there was this, oh my Lanta, like they are going to think I am flaky and all of these things. But it goes back to, I was like, well, Lord, okie dokie.
Mhm.
And so I had to send emails out and just say, the Lord has asked me to lay this down, and I am, and I am so sorry for
Mhm.
wasting time. And do you know that the people that I had interviewed could not have been more gracious or kind?
Mhm.
And I'm so thankful for that. But honestly, even if they hadn't been, it didn't matter.
Right.
So now fast forward to now, all of a sudden God has opened up these opportunities for me without my beating my head against the wall and doing what I wanted to do. And I think that that's another thing that's really important in leadership. I'm just a firm believer. I know a lot of people ask me, how do you get into speaking? How do you get into speaking? And I always say, I have no clue. Like, as far as, um, let me say this, like when it comes to like business speaking, of course you can reach out, you can be with the speaking bureau. I mean, all those different things. But when it comes to being a Christian speaker, and there may be people that disagree with me, and that's cool.
Mhm.
I firmly trust God that if he wants you on a stage, those doors will open. I've walked through too many of them.
Right.
But I think it's one of those things that you have to be prepared
Mhm.
and you have to be willing to lay it down and wait for his timing.
Yes.
So all that to say, so with Speaking for Bloggers, like I said, laid it down. And then all of a sudden, Ruth Sukup from Elite Blog Academy reached out. I got to be on her podcast, the Do It Scared podcast, which was awesome.
Yeah.
And she was awesome to talk with. It was just like talking like with a friend, just like with
Right.
you. And then all of a sudden I was thinking, so there's a big conference that she does. And I thought, man, I would sure love to be able to speak at that conference. And so then I went to my mother, talked about it, had prayed about it. And mother said, I would wait. I wouldn't reach out. I wouldn't ask. Because if it's meant to be, the Lord will make it happen. 3 weeks later, she reached out and said, do you want to share your story and teach on the Activate stage?
Wow. That's
I mean,
amazing.
it's amazing because all glory goes
Yeah.
to the Lord.
Right. Yeah.
All glory goes to him.
Mhm.
And so I never have to question, is this my desire or
Mm.
is this his desire? And I mean, I
Right.
just hear it because it's like he's so, like we never doubt his faithfulness.
Yeah.
And even if it hadn't happened, then I can have, just like when it was like, no, ma'am, you're not doing it. I'm going to ask you not to do it now. It's because the timing was so wrong.
Yeah.
And he had been lining all these other things up for me, and I would have blown it
Yeah.
had I done it in my own strength because that's what I wanted to do.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's just, I think that with Christian leadership, there just are some differences in that it's not always beating down that door
Mm.
or those things that everybody else tells you
Mm.
you have to do.
Mm.
I think instead of the beating down the doors, it's spending time in prayer and having your speech prepared and having the things that you think he's calling you for, even though he's saying, well, slow down, just not just yet,
Mhm.
but that we do those preparatory things so that when it's go, we're ready.
Yes. And I love that point that, really it's about God's timing and that I think that the bigger doors sometimes open when we're obedient in the small things, right? Like the fact that you
Oh,
were willing to say no, willing to accept no as an answer at the time, then God opened something even better, with
so
this
much
speaking
better.
opportunity. So I just love how he does that. And it's also the fact that you took that question in your mind to someone else that you trusted and prayed about it with them. That's also something that we as leaders, I think that keeps us humble and that keeps us centered when we can go to someone else and say, will you pray about this decision with me and help me
Oh.
have some wisdom?
Right, because it made perfect sense for me to reach out.
Yeah, right.
Oh, the interview went well. We connected well.
Hmm.
By every reasonable standard, anybody would have said, well, that was a missed opportunity. Abby,
Mm.
great job.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. So true.
But I think I needed that Gideon moment of putting out the fleece that God really was saying it was go time for
Mm.
speaking for waters because
Hmm.
I didn't ever want to jump the gun again.
Yeah. Right.
And so it was, and so in that, so many things he affirmed to my heart. And then just what a great story for his glory
Hmm.
and not about me.
Right. Yes. Love it. So, if you had any advice to give to a younger leader, someone maybe just starting out in ministry or in her career, what would you tell her?
Uh, the first thing I would say is I would pray diligently that God would send you the right mentor.
Mm.
Oh, hands down, that would be my fervent prayer, first
Mm-hmm.
and foremost, is that God would put that person in your life that has been there, done that, and can help you navigate those troubled waters.
Mm.
God wants us in community, and there is just such value to the mentor and to the mentee. So I
Yes.
would say find the mentor, number one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and number two, it would be continually strengthening your faith and growing in your walk.
Mm.
Um, and it's very easy to get very busy with all the business, all the things that it takes to lead and then train
Mm.
and navigate all
Right.
of those waters that always keep the most important thing the most important thing.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Those would be the two biggest things.
Yeah.
And I'll say the last one, most importantly, don't be afraid to fail.
Mm.
The most important thing you can
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. Yes. And so many times, I'm sure in your journey, as in mine, there are times where we do stuff that's just like, well, that didn't work.
Woo!
But you learn something from it, right? You learn from that failure. So,
Every single time. And here's the thing, you're never going to grow if you don't give yourself the opportunity to fail.
mhm.
You're just not.
Mhm.
And so that has been the biggest thing for me, is that failure is not fatal,
Mhm.
and it really allows you to have that future
Yeah.
because you're still willing to take that next step.
Mhm. Yes, so true. Yes. So speaking of learning from failure, I avidly believe that leaders are learners and that we all as leaders should be continually learning new things and investing in opportunities to grow. So is there anything that you have been reading or learning or listening to lately that you would like to share that has benefited you?
Well, the biggest thing that where I struggle with is marketing.
Okay.
If I had to say an area of weakness, is very awkward for me. I have no business
Mhm.
background, those sorts of things. And so I've really had to identify those weaknesses
Yeah.
and work towards strengthening them. And so I found a class that is dealing with one of the biggest mistakes I've made in my business is I've built a very big list, but then I didn't really know what to do with them.
Mhm.
And then, I mean, I don't know if we're going specifics, but my opt in really didn't, one of the opt ins did not mesh with really what we were
Mm.
doing. And
Mhm.
so it's been pretty much a disaster.
Mm.
So let me just own that. And so what I'm doing now is, so we'll call that a failure.
Mhm.
Uh, but now I'm looking at ways to fix it. And so one of the biggest things that I'm learning is that selling doesn't have to be sleazy, it doesn't have to be disingenuous. That it This is the best marketing that I've ever education that I've gotten, simply because it's very in alignment
Mm.
with what I believe and
Mm.
what I believe to be true and right and righteous.
Mhm.
And so, even though the person teaching it is not Christian,
Mhm.
and it's not taught from a Christian viewpoint, my viewpoint of the material
Mm.
is.
Right. Yeah, and I love how you took something that you realized was a weakness, and then that's what you decided to pursue learning more about. Because, like you said earlier, we are in such a noisy space, whether you are in the church world or the online marketing world or entrepreneur, or you're working full time. I mean, there's noise everywhere, right? And we're constantly bombarded with information that probably could help us in one way or another, but it may not be what we actually need right then. So,
I think that is a brilliant point about, I think there comes a point too as leaders that we have to limit the voices we allow in.
mhm, yes.
Um, so one of my favorite students of all time, she's just a little genius, and we were talking about multitasking and productivity and all those
Mm.
different things, and she made this really super cool point, and she was like, "Okay, count to 10 as fast as you can," and I did. Then she said, "Do your ABCs as fast as you can," so I did. Then she said, "Now I want you to alternate the two." So then you had to say A1, B2. And all of a sudden, it was like something so simple that you can do if you
Mm.
focus solely on it.
Mhm.
You can do things twice as fast if you quit trying to multitask because it feels like you're busy.
Yeah. Such good advice. So, as we are wrapping up, Abby, what is the best way for people to connect with you? And if you have anything that you want to mention, a free gift or anything like that, feel free to let us know what people can do and how they can connect with you.
Well, I would love for you to connect with me. If you're more in you want some of this Bible reading and you want, basically, I have a team of people at rockthis.org, and it's for women whose life hasn't turned out the way they envisioned,
Mm.
and about strengthening your faith through Bible study, through prayer, and even, as crazy as it sounds, organization. Because when things are spiraling out
Mm.
of control, it's just a little tangible help to kind of get your space in order.
Right.
So you can find me at rockthis.org and sign up. We have a fun little Facebook group. Or if you are in that, you're an online business owner and you're thinking, okay, I need to navigate the world of speaking.
Yes.
Come on over, come on over. It's going to be fun. And that's at speakingforbloggers.com.
Mm,
And there's a button that says, do you have some tips? And so you can sign up for there and then you'll get tips right into your
okay,
inbox.
awesome. And so for
So
someone who is not a blogger, would that still apply to them, or is it a specific for people that are bloggers or business owners that are wanting to expand by speaking?
that is a great question. Actually, I'm trying to stay on that focus. So
Okay.
basically, I'm starting with the live streaming, but I also do coaching packages.
Okay.
So if you have been asked to speak, then I have a 1 hour coaching package
Mhm.
where you can have this one idea that you want to bounce off me to see if I
Mm,
can help you. Or then I have a package, it's called the 90-day mentor, and
okay.
that's basically where we get your keynote from soup to nuts.
Okay.
Done.
Awesome. Awesome, Abby. Well, I appreciate your time so much, taking the time to talk with us today. And I know that everyone is going to be so blessed by hearing your story and your experiences. Is there anything else that you want to add or that we didn't talk about that you feel would be beneficial for these other leaders that are listening?
I would love to give you this beautiful sound bite right now. But the truth is, I think that it's stay true to God,
Mm,
stay true to yourself. And honestly, God will bless those endeavors.
mm, absolutely. Okay. Thank you so much, Abby.
Thanks for having me. You're so great.
Wasn't Abby's story amazing? I hope that you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. And remember, you can grab the show notes over at estherlittlefield.com/Abby. That's ABBY. And you can also join our private Facebook group so that you can connect with Abby and Holly and I and the rest of the amazing women in our group. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love for you to subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. And of course, it would be amazing if you'd leave us a rating and review. This helps more women like you find the podcast. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.